invited down to the White House about 6 months ago. And the subject came to a grand bargain. And we were asking how this would work out. Madam President, I would ask for an additional 5 minutes, if I may have it.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, and I'll try to wrap up, and I appreciate the senator who wishes to speak and has had time reserved, and I'll try to get this done. So we were meeting with the President. I was bringing up over-regulation, but the rest of the people were talking about a grand bargain and what could happen. The President said on tax reform, why can't we start with a clean page? Basically, everybody agreed, and then said also we could take mortgage interest and charitable giving and retirement, and we could means test those, and we could start from there. And I thought, oh boy, here we go again. Income redistribution. That is not an answer. And I would just say before we enter into any negotiations, we ought to make sure that the Budget Control Act, the Fiscal Cliff Act, which was negotiated in good faith with the Vice President and has resulted in lower spending, actual decreases in spending in this federal government ever since the Korean War. That's unbelievable. So in going to negotiate, I don't want to give up in regards to that, and I don't want a situation where the President has said, I gave up on CPI, so I need $800 billion in revenue. The distinguished majority leader has said it's $1 trillion. So if we're going to raise $1 trillion in revenue, here we go back again that whatever negotiation comes down the pike is going to be more spending and more taxes. People are already now really figuring out what their tax bill is going to happen with Obamacare. We don't need a situation where we sit down and we negotiate simply for more taxes and spending. So without going into the constitutional implications of granting the authority on autopilot from the President, I would just say I'm adamantly opposed to giving any President that much control over the budget. Why does all this matter? Why am I making a speech? Why is my friend across the aisle going to make her speech? The debt limit is currently $16.7 trillion. Debt has increased more than $6 trillion since the President took office, more than any other President in our history. The main source of this tremendous growth in the debt is entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Paul Ryan has a plan to fix that. At least it ought to be on the table, see where we go with it. Without changes, spending on these programs is expected to grow by 79% over 10 years. In fact, by law, there is no upper limit on how much we spend on these programs. This spending added to interest payments on the debt will make up close to 65% of the budget in 10 years. We won't have any discretionary spending. The Congressional Budget Office reports that we remain on an unsustainable tax. So all we are asking, prudently I hope, is that any increase in the federal debt limit needs to be coupled with real tangible cuts in discretionary spending and meaningful structural reform to entitlement spending. We need to get this done to rein in our unsustainable debt to ensure that these programs are there for our children and our grandchildren. I ask unanimous consent that an article by Thomas Sowell, a senior fellow, Hoover Institution from Standard University, be inserted in the record at this point, and yield back any time that I may have.
Madam President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. As my colleague from Kansas said, I also came to the floor today to talk about the unnecessary government shutdown that's continuing and having widespread ramifications in New Hampshire and across the country. But I would just like to respond to some of what he said about the Budget Control Act and about the current state of the deficit, because the fact is the deficit under this president has been reduced by more than 50% since he took office. It's on course to reach a little over 4% of GDP by the end of 2015, I believe, and by 2023 to get even lower, down to a little over 2%. So there's no doubt that we need a plan to deal with the long-term debt and deficits of this country. And most of us who supported the Budget Control Act thought that's what we had done, that we had put in place a committee that was actually going to come up with an agreement on how we could get to a long-term plan to deal with this country's debt and deficits. And it's really unfortunate that some of the people who were appointed to that committee didn't share in that commitment. So I think it's important to remind us all where we are. We have made significant improvements on reducing the deficit in this country. We have been willing to look at a long-term agreement to deal with the debt and deficits, and I think that's what we ought to do. And I would hope that as the result of this government shutdown, we could get some agreement from both sides of the aisle to actually do this. But my main purpose, Madam President, in coming to the floor today is to talk again about the impact of this shutdown on too many people who are caught in the middle between this unnecessary inflicted crises that we're seeing in Washington and the impact that it's having on families, on small businesses, on the economy of New Hampshire and the country. We are now in the 9th day of this shutdown. In New Hampshire, we've seen hundreds of federal workers who have been furloughed. Now, some of those are back to work. Fortunately, at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, most of those people are back to work, and that's very good news. But we still have people at the Forest Service. We have people who work for the federal government in other capacities all over the state who have not been fortunate enough to be called back to work. And I would just remind everybody that even for those people who are back at work, they're not being paid. And so they're working without pay. In New Hampshire, Small Business Administration loans have been halted. That's true across the country. Federal Housing Administration and VA loans have been slowed down. We've seen the White Mountain National Forest, which is a federal forest that hosts more visitors than Yosemite and Yellowstone National Parks combined, and yet people who are traveling through our beautiful White Mountain Forest at this time of the year looking at the foliage are not even able to use the restrooms because of the shutdown. I really wanted to this morning also talk about some of those businesses that I've heard from who are being hurt by the shutdown. New Hampshire is truly a small business state. 96% of employers in the Granite State are considered small businesses, and they're the backbone of our economy. They're also where most of the new jobs are going to come from. 2 out of every 3 new jobs in the United States are created by a small business. But the shutdown is really hitting them hard. I heard this morning from 2 of our businesses who have been established in the state for a long time. They had national reputations. Typeflex, which is an aerospace company in the Lakes region. They do a lot of business for the Department of Defense, and they also provide supplies to larger companies. They told me that their inventory is piling up on their docks now because they don't have anybody to inspect it, because those federal officials who do that are not working. They're furloughed. And they said it's really going to be a problem in 10 days if we don't get this resolved, when they have to report to the corporation their bottom line numbers, and that will show on their reports, and that will affect their company. Then I also heard from some representatives from Smith's Tubular, which is a medical device equipment company that does business with the VA and with the military, and they also do a lot of work with FDA. They said that they're seeing their contracts affected, and they've heard from FDA that they shouldn't provide the payments that they normally provide to them because there's nobody at FDA to process those payments. So that's having an effect on the ability of businesses to innovate, to provide the products that are needed. Now, in New Hampshire, we've seen an impact on lending. The Small Business Administration has reported that loans are not being originated. And you don't need a PhD in economics to understand that if small businesses can't access capital and credit, that there are real economic consequences. One of our largest SBA lenders in New Hampshire is a company called the Granite State Development Corporation. They've got 20 of their loans that are on hold already because of the shutdown. And then this morning I heard from a community bank in New Hampshire called Provident Bank that it has about half a dozen SBA loans that are held up right now. And one of those loans is for a newly starting up entrepreneur who wants to open an orange leaf frozen yogurt franchise in New Hampshire. All the paperwork's ready to go, but Provident Bank can't get the final approval for the loan until the SBA is up and running again. So if the shutdown continues, Provident Bank is concerned that interest rates are going to rise, and that as interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing for small businesses is going to go up. Well, as the presiding officer knows, because her state is much like New Hampshire with a lot of small businesses, access to credit is the lifeblood of those small businesses. And right now, we're preventing them from getting the help that they need. Then we have small businesses in New Hampshire who really rely on consumer demand. I heard from Charles Moulton, who's the owner of a New Hampshire maple syrup company called New Hampshire Gold. No, this is the time when people are looking to come see the foliage and sample our maple syrup in New Hampshire. He has 4 employees, and his maple syrup company has a storefront in New Hampshire, but it also sells one of their signature products, their maple syrup, to Zion National Park in Utah. Kind of an unlikely location for a New Hampshire maple syrup. But New Hampshire Gold sells to tourists who come there from all over the world during the summer and early fall. But now, because Zion National Park, like all of our national parks, is shut down, New Hampshire Gold sales have dried up. And while they continue to sell in Concord, New Hampshire in their retail store, much of the cushion that they needed to get through the winter into next year come from that location at Zion. And they can't afford to lose those dollars as they're thinking about how to get through the rest of this year. New Hampshire Gold is just one of the thousands of small businesses that have been hurt by the shutdown of our national parks. Visitors to the parks spend nearly $13 billion a year in regions within 60 miles of the park. And this shutdown is hurting not just visitors to those parks, it's hurting small businesses like New Hampshire Gold and all of the other small businesses around our parks who depend on that tourism business. And there's no doubt that this shutdown is hurting our economy. Economist Mark Zandi projected that a 3 to 4 week shutdown would reduce gross domestic product by 1.4% during the fourth quarter. He noted that the projection likely underestimates the economic fallout, since it doesn't really fully account for the impact of such a lengthy shutdown on consumers, businesses, and investor psychology. The bottom line is clear. The shutdown is bad for our economy, it's bad for middle-class families, and it's bad for the country. And as we look at the looming deadline for when we need to raise the debt ceiling so we can pay the bills that this country has incurred, there is potentially even greater fallout for America. Holding the economy and critical services hostage to score political points is just irresponsible. We need to open the government. We need to raise the debt ceiling so we can pay our bills. With the economy finally showing signs of improvement, the last thing we should be doing is what's happening right now. So I'm really hopeful that the House will do what's right, that they will pass a short-term funding bill, that will get our government running again, and that we then can continue to negotiate on what we need to do to address the long-term debt and deficits in the country, and also talk about where we need to invest to make sure that this country stays competitive in the future. So thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Functioning again for all departments because veterans work in all of them, for all veteran services because veterans are impacted by all of them, and again from my perspective, the quickest, cleanest way to do this, and we could have the government up and running tonight, is to vote for a clean funding bill. So, Mr. Secretary, again, thank you for your presence today, for answering our questions and commenting on our statements. My time is up, so I'll yield back to the chairman, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and also thank the men and women that work. I'd like to thank the men and women who work for your department to take care of those who have made so many sacrifices in defense of our freedom. My question goes to the 4 hospitals that are under construction by the VA. And VA contingency plan states that certain, quote, major construction and facilities management support functions will be suspended, unquote, during the shutdown. What has been the status of the 4 ongoing major projects in Aurora, Las Vegas, Orlando, and New Orleans during the shutdown?
Congressman, I indicated that where we have work underway on site, that work will continue. Our administrative oversight responsibilities will be diminished, but we will exercise those responsibilities. Payments to contractors and therefore payments to the subs, an administrative process that will be slowed, but in time payment will be made. We just don't have the folks to do that as robustly as we would like. But in terms of site work with supervision, that will continue in those locations you described.
Mr. Secretary, as you know, the payment has already been, the process has already been very slow, according to a GAO report that came out in April. In terms of these setbacks that you talk about, will they affect, in your view, the completion date and the budget totals for each project for these 4 major hospitals?
Our work is slowed. The longer this goes, I would be concerned that we begin to affect the end of the project, that we continue to slide project execution to the right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Takano. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to associate myself with the remarks with the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke. I think he stated very clearly my sentiments about what needs to be done to clean CR. And I also want to thank the chairman for the tone he set for this committee. Very bipartisan sentiments. I think you, Mr. Chairman, understand that each of us on this committee, regardless of party, have a deep and sincere commitment to our nation's veterans. So I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. Let me also state that, you know, beyond the bipartisan bill that we passed on MILCON veterans, even the Budget Control Act of 2011 reflects that bipartisan spirit in the fact that it exempted the Veterans Administration from sequestration cuts. And it's my belief that it's my conjecture that what is happening in the Senate and the holdup with consideration of this bill has to do with the complexities of sequestration and the divisions that are occurring between our two sides. I mean, there's a reluctance to pass all the appropriations bills until we see in toto what we're dealing with in terms of whether we're going to, how we're going to have to deal with that limit, whether we're going to lift it or some negotiations going to happen over that. We need to get to negotiations on the bigger picture. I cherish this committee. I cherish being on it because it is one corner of the Congress that is still functional. And I want to fight fiercely to keep that spirit, and I thank the chairman for the small ways in this committee that he's tried to keep that alive. And I yield back to balance my time. I have to get back to a meeting in my office.
Thank you very much. Looks like Dr. Winstrup is gone. Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your testimony, General. General, let's summarize again. I walked in just a little late in your statement, but which programs I understand because of legislation that we passed, the VA, the health care, the outpatient clinics, the hospitals, the CBOCs are protected. Is that correct? They will not be impacted. But tell me which programs will be impacted due to the shutdown. I think our constituents have a right to know, and if you could briefly summarize, I'd appreciate it very much.
Congressman, the Veterans Health Administration, because of its special opportunity to have advanced appropriations, courtesy of the Congress, is funded. And so that's hospitals, medical centers, hospitals, vet centers, community-based outpatient clinics, and every version of health care center in between.
No exception, correct?
No.
No exception. They will be funded.
The only exception where there is impact is the North Chicago, where I say it is operating, but it's in an accepted category. Everyone else in the VA system is fully funded.
Okay, thank you very much. Which programs will be impacted, in your opinion? And if you can give me some deadlines. I know we went through a lot of this, but I'd like for you to summarize.
All the other programs that are not advanced funded are impacted and being impacted. And some of this is the degree to which and when they're going to be impacted is a function of how much 2013 residual carryover funds we have available. A device that the Congress authorizes, certain percentages that we are allowed to just carry over to transition between budget years. But if this continues, every one of our departments will be impacted. We have a requirement in the Benefits Administration, even if we have expended the mandatory account and therefore have no necessary implication, this is one of the clauses for exception, to keep people working. At that point, there will be a significant requirement to furlough workforce who will be working until the end of this month, towards the end of this month. Thereafter, we will have roughly 1,000 folks operating in the 56 regional offices to ensure that we can receive, account, date stamp, and control claims that will continue to be submitted, both through the normal process and through the call center. So there are people working in the call center as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yield back. Thank you, General.
Mr. Negrete McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I know that you said that the VA not only deals with the VA, but other departments also. And so those veterans receiving educational benefits and stipends under the GI Bill and that are attending school now, because school has already started at various institutions, what will happen after November the 1st? You know, if they won't get their money, have you talked to the colleges, the institutions, the universities?
Congresswoman, we are doing everything we can while we have mandatory funds available. At least two accounts two categories that we will expend money to cover immediately. One is the retroactive aspects of a claim. So someone who is due money for previous authorization up until this point, to the best of our ability, we pay those, and for students currently in school, we pay those as well. But that draws down this mandatory account I'm speaking about. So on 1 November, before the end of this month, it'll be in a situation where I can no longer pay. And the 1 November payments that should be going out will not be able to do that unless more mandatory funding is provided. So it's, if there is funding in the mandatory account, which has got to come through appropriation, then I can accept people to continue to work to draw that down. Without that, by law, I have to furlough these folks.
So what happens to students that are already in classes, that have already started the semester or the quarter, whichever they're on?
Well, at this point, this is a crucial question because for students who have already registered and had their tuition and fees paid up front, I think they're going to be okay. And if they have drawn their book stipend, then I think they're probably covered. Every situation is different. But I will not be able to pay the monthly housing stipend. And that would be an issue.
Have the schools or the universities or the colleges made any kind of, I'm sure they're aware of our shenanigans here. So.
Well, I can assure you we've reached out to schools and doing the best we can to get their support and cooperation to be able to carry this for payment. But the schools are not involved in the housing stipend. That's directly from VA to the students. So that is an issue. And I would tell you that in my past experience, the schools have been quite cooperative, but there are 6,000 of them, and so we want to be sure that, you know, we have contacted all of them.
Thank you so much for your testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Walorski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. You had mentioned earlier the South Bend CBOC would be delayed. We were notified more than 4 weeks ago. There was already a delay in the South Bend CBOC. So my question is, it obviously has nothing to do with this government shutdown. So would your plan then be to expedite that CBOC once the furloughed workers are back? And if something was delayed prior to a shutdown, that it would be expedited after a shutdown?
Yeah, we'll do our best to get back on schedule. It was going slower than we would like, but this has just exacerbated the situation. But our effort will be to get all of these projects back online as soon as we can.
And then my second question, I appreciate that. My second question is, according to the most recent Monday morning report, the Indianapolis Regional Office has 11,460 claims pending. Has nothing to do with the government shutdown. This is prior to the shutdown. And these claims are taking an average of 402 days to complete. Over a year still in the state of Indiana to process these claims. So my first question is there an urgent plan when these furlough workers come back to deal with these hot spots in the country? And number two, if this furlough plan retroactive Fairness Act is signed by the President, are your employees coming back to work the next morning?
I don't know about the next morning, but as soon as they're notified, we expect that they'll be in promptly.
And then what would the plan be for high-impact areas like Indiana with 11,000 veterans by no fault of their own, no fault of a government shutdown, sitting for over a year still waiting for claims to be mitigated on their behalf?
Yeah, well, Congresswoman, again, I think you recall we have made decisions that created an increase in the inventory and increase in the backlog, and we predicted 3 years ago that backlog would sort of hit the high point this year, and it did on 25 March. Since that time, we prioritized claims that are older than 2 years. That essentially 99% of those are done. Claims that are 1 year of age or older, we're well into the 80% of taking that down from like 300,000 down into the double digits here. I'll have to look at Indianapolis and see what the issues are. But they would be in this prioritization that we've been in. Anything older than 1 year we intended to have done here before the end of this year. And we're on a track to do that and like to get back on it.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Ms. Titus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I will apologize, if some won't, for the inappropriate attempt by people to drag you into the politics of this unfortunate situation. I'm the ranking member of the Disability Assistance Subcommittee, and I carefully monitor those Monday morning reports. I guess we won't be able to get those now because of this unnecessary shutdown. And I'm optimistic about the strides you've made. We've heard in that committee about the 80% of the one-year backlog, the 99% of the two-year backlogs. I think it's remarkable progress, and it's just a crying shame that some of that is going to now be pushed back because of this shutdown. We've spoken a number of times about what's happening in the Reno office, which serves Las Vegas. It also has very long waiting periods, but we've addressed some of that. General Hickey has been out to visit. That's kind of in process and making some progress. There's still a long way to go. But I've been hearing some conflicting reports about the closing of the regional offices. Some closed, some not. Could you kind of go into some detail about how that choice is being made or what's happening in those regional offices during this shutdown?
Yeah. Congresswoman, I sort of laid out a timeline here that I have roughly the Benefits Administration, just round figures, about 20,000 people. Nearly 8,000 of them have been furloughed 2 days ago. The remaining 13,000 continue to work.
Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
A quorum is not present. The Majority Leader.
I move to instruct the Sergeant Arms to request the presence of absent senators.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Copes, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy,
Aye.
Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman.
It's almost got a quorum in Vermont.
Yes, sir. Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts,
Mr. President.
Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Mikulski, Murphy, Nelson, Sanders, Schatz, and Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Thank you. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Roberts, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Yeah. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye.
So that's where we have that.
Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Coburn? No. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Chiesa? Aye. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Heller? No. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Hatch? Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Now they're just checking on Rockefeller, just to make sure. Mr. Rockefeller? Aye.
Other senators who wish to vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 78. The nays are 18. The motion instruct the Sergeant at Arms is agreed to, and a quorum is present.
Mr. President.
The majority,